for this session, Andrea G. Tatum. Andrea considers herself a collector of skills. She's been a product marketer, a certified project manager, an international events professional, and even a Zumba instructor. Early in her career, she was named one of the most influential women in Atlanta for her focus on diversifying audiences. After working as the senior manager of inclusion at Tableau Salesforce, she brought all of those skills together and began AGT Diversity Consulting, where she coaches DEI leaders of tomorrow and helps companies become more diverse, equitable, and inclusive. She's also the Senior Director of Corpus Engagement at Catalyst, where she works with more than 30 companies to drive their DEI strategies. Please join me in welcoming Andrea G. Tatum.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that introduction. Because we've got such a short amount of time, I'm just going to dive right in to talking about demystifying DEI careers. We know there has been so much buzz around diversity and inclusion, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, that I just wanted to spend a little bit of time with you all today talking about what does it really mean to work in this field? And hopefully I'll get around to answering a few of your questions about, how could you possibly even get into working in this field if you even need to get into working in this field. But I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So according to Indeed.com, between September of 2019 and September of 2020, the number of job postings for diversity, equity, and inclusion roles rose over 56%. And that is, even more significant in the US because we know that as the pandemic started, we started to see a number of jobs go away. But unfortunately, following the murder of George Floyd, we saw a really significant increase in diversity, equity, and inclusion jobs being on the rise as companies were kind of doubling down on their commitment to things like Black Lives Matter and making public statements and promising to fight for equality both inside and outside of the workplace, right? So as we've seen this rise in opportunities, that means there's also been a rise in the number of people that we actually need to be in diversity, equity, and inclusion types of roles. So what does that actually mean? Because what I found when I transitioned into a DEI role is that there was kind of a general lack of knowledge about what it actually meant to do the work. And I find that there's a lot of people who are incredibly passionate about this topic. And maybe they've taken some courses or they've been an ERG leader, and they're really thinking that this may be a good fit for them. But they don't always understand what skills are needed or what should I be doing to prepare myself for this type of role. So that's really what I do in my career and as a part of AGT Diversity Consulting. I really help people to gain clarity, right? Clarity about what does that passion really mean and if it even constitutes an actual career change. Clarity about what companies are actually looking for when they post certain types of roles, and clarity about how their previous skills, education, and experience actually align to specific roles within the DEI ecosystem. So for today, I'm going to spend a little bit of time demystifying what it means specifically to work in DEI within corporate spaces. And we'll do that by one, kind of highlighting the fact that, oh, hopefully there we go. We got all the screens working. So we're going to do that by highlighting some of the most common roles in diversity, equity, and inclusion, again, specifically in corporate spaces, and then uncovering some of the primary skills and experiences that are needed for these roles, and just having a really frank conversation about what it means to do this work, because it comes with some really serious roadblocks, and there are some pros and cons of doing this work. So where I want to start is the fact that most often when people think about working in diversity, equity, and inclusion, they kind of asked this question of like, where should these roles come from? Well, there was this really great study done by Russell Reynolds and Associates that looked at the chief diversity officer, which is that role that most people really think of. And they did a little bit of research on where people were coming in to these roles. And as you can see here, there are a lot of different backgrounds: legal, communications, business, some of them specifically in D&I, and a large number of people coming in from human resources. So, really what this meant was that there were a wide range of backgrounds, and that means that they're also bringing a significant number of skills with them. But one thing they also uncovered is that there were some really specific common traits that the chief diversity officers have. So you can see that here on the screen. I won't read all of them to you, but these are really common themes that they realized kind of came together when they were looking at the different chief diversity officers that they surveyed. For the purpose of today, I think I really want to talk specifically about one of those attributes, and that is the idea of the Chief Diversity Officer being a strategic executor. So, what does that even mean? I wish I had the time to do a deep dive into all of it, but really what this means is that, like many other C-level roles, they're really guiding the path. They are creating the strategy and really thinking about what is going to need to be done holistically. They're not always the person who is pulling every single lever to achieve these goals, but they ultimately typically kind of come up with three big pillars of what they're trying to accomplish in their strategy. I'm guessing some of you probably are familiar with some of these different pillars that they come up with because they're pretty common, right? We often hear we need to recruit talent from diverse backgrounds. We need to make sure we're developing that talent, and which is really important, we need to make sure that we are retaining that talent. So when I'm thinking about the chief diversity officer as the strategist, they're thinking, how do we do all of this holistically? And there's a lot of different pieces that really have to go into that puzzle, but they need help doing it. They can't necessarily be everything for everybody. And so that's why it's actually really interesting that there are several different diversity, equity, and inclusion roles. So if you're thinking about getting into the diversity, equity, and inclusion, don't limit yourself to just looking at head of diversity and inclusion or chief diversity officers. There are so many different roles. And so I'm just going to give you a snapshot of a couple, a few roles that you may find, right? And this list definitely is not exhaustive. It's just really there to kind of give you an idea of some of the different types of roles that could actually exist within a DEI ecosystem. And as you look further down, you'll notice that there's some specific roles like a DEI facilitator or a DEI consultant. Those roles, may not be in the more corporate ecosystem. You may find those in roles where that company is specifically focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I won't go too much into detail on those, but I really like to share this. And if you can imagine, every company is starting to put their own unique kind of ideas around DEI, which means you may not find these titles to be exactly consistent as you look across different companies. So as you're thinking about that, you may not always find roles that specifically say the word diversity in them, but they absolutely impact that bottom line when it comes to recruiting, retaining, and developing talent from diverse backgrounds. So, I want to talk about some of the most common roles in DEI in corporate spaces that are here on this list. We've already talked a little bit about the Chief Diversity Officer, but you'll notice that there are six additional here: the DEI analyst, the diversity business partner, your DEI coordinator or specialist, your diversity sourcer, diversity recruiting program manager, and your employee resource group or ERG program manager. Now, These roles are all really, really different. And I think it's really important to understand that the skills and the experience that go along with each of these roles can also vary pretty significantly. Like, I may need some really different skills if I'm an analyst versus an ERG manager. And I'll go into a little bit of detail on all of these and just try to give you a little bit of a taste on how those skills and experience differ. But one of the key things that I talk about with the clients who I work with is being really clear about where your skills and experiences will have the most value so that you can customize your resume and make sure that you are pitching yourself in a way that really is able to prove why your skills and your experience are a good fit for the role that you're applying to. And there's both hard skills and soft skills that are really important in these various roles. So, let's just take a minute and talk about some of these different roles. I want to start with the DEI analyst. And like I said, I'm going to just kind of go into these really, really quickly. That DEI analyst is someone who probably has some experience working with really specific tools. And they're helping to create a dashboard for maybe your chief diversity officer or your business partner so that your organization can really understand what it is that you're driving towards. You've probably often heard the phrase, which is kind of cliche, but it's pretty real, which is you can't change what you can't measure. So having a DEI analyst, or in some roles or in some companies, they just have a people analytics manager, they're really looking at this data and helping to organize. They may have some experience using Tableau or even using something like Power BI and really being able to pull out all of this data from your HRIS system to help create a dashboard and understand what's happening, such as the number of people that are represented from a specific background in a certain role and at a certain level. And often that DEI analyst is working really, really closely with a diversity business partner. It's a fairly new role that I'm seeing pop up. So you may also be working really closely with just your HR business partner. But that role of your diversity business partner is to really also be analytical and strategic. So let's use the idea of a diversity business partner for an engineering team. They're going to be looking at that data to determine who's coming in, who's going out, but also who should be developed within that line of business. What opportunities are there? And let's say perhaps to make sure that we're getting more women of color into leadership roles. Oftentimes, we see that there are women and maybe women of color at entry level roles, but they may not be making it up into the actual SVP or higher roles. So that's something your diversity business partner and your line of business leader can look at based on the data that your DEI analyst has provided them. So it's really important to understand that before you even go out and start trying to recruit new talent. But speaking of recruiting new talent, let's talk a little bit about the diversity sourcer. That diversity sourcer is really there to help do that. I call them the seeker. They are on the lookout for really great talent from diverse backgrounds. And they often work hand in hand with your talent acquisition team to make sure that there's a number of people who are being added into the system so that we have people to be able to choose from. And that diversity sourcer tends to really work closely with your diversity recruiting program manager. Now, when I think about a diversity recruiting program manager, again, this person tends to be really strategic. They can see things at a high level, but they're also really good at being very granular and thoughtful about what you need to do. And in many cases, this diversity program manager may be working closely with HR or and your CDO so that they're building that strategy holistically and they're developing a program. And so let's stick with the engineering team. They're developing a program that will help to ensure that you are recruiting more talent from diverse communities, specifically with the skills that you need inside of an engineering department. Well, I know that's a lot of moving pieces already, but I want to just stop here and think a little bit more about recruiting. Because oftentimes I think there are some misconceptions that happen when we say we want to make sure we're recruiting more people from diverse backgrounds. How many of you all have ever heard someone say, well, we don't want to lower the bar? It's really not quite the right approach that we're thinking about. When we're thinking about recruiting talent from diverse backgrounds, the idea is that we really want to make sure that we are actively seeking people out who maybe hadn't even known that that opportunity existed. So let's say that you have 5 roles open on your team. Well, that sourcer and the program manager may be able to identify some specific places, such as the NESB or Lesbians Who Tech, where they can go and actively recruit talent. So now you've got this great diverse slate that may look different than if you were only referring people who already look like the people you have in your organization. And you're still bringing in the best talent. You've just made sure that you've really opened up the scope so that you can get even more people in and knowledgeable and applying about those roles. So, again, when you think about that diversity business partner, they're really there also to help think more about those areas around developing and retaining, and not always as much on just the recruiting piece. It takes all of those pieces really coming together. So when I think about the developing and retaining, one thing that the diversity business partner may be doing is making suggestions on who are some people that might be really high potential and being able to be developed and moving into those next roles. One place that you can look in your organization for some of that talent is within your employee resource groups. So it's really great when you have a really strong employee resource group manager who can help you to understand when you've got people within the ERGs who may be a good tap for future leadership roles. One of the great things about employee resource groups is that they really have a way of helping to provide leadership opportunities. And in a really great company, managers understand the value that is there with the employee resource groups. So, your ERG group program manager is so much more than just an event planner. It's really important that that's a skill that they have with them, because oftentimes we know that the employee resource group manager is helping to plan and cultivate employee resource group events such as Pride or Asian Heritage Month or Black History Month or whatever that may be. But the role is absolutely so much more than that. They're making sure that the ERGs have budgets, stay on plan, and really are making sure that the ERG's strategy aligns to the overarching strategy that the Chief Diversity Officer has created. So I know I ran through all of these roles really quickly, but I just wanted to kind of give you an idea of how all of these roles really begin to play together. Now, there's one role I haven't really talked about just yet, and that is of the D&I coordinator, the DEI manager, or maybe even your D&I specialist. Oftentimes, I think of that role as kind of a catch-all. This person may really need to be able to roll up their sleeves and be able to do a little bit of everything. They typically have to be a little bit strategic and a little bit on the side of doing execution. And that is a really great role for somebody who likes doing everything or who wants an opportunity to kind of get their hands dirty and learn how to do a lot of different things. Now, whether or not all of these roles exist within a company, it's really hard to say. As companies mature, they tend to open up even more roles. In many cases, you may only have a chief diversity officer, and they do have to do a lot of this work on their own. And so it's really important to make sure that you are understanding how the company functions when you're looking at working for them. You're going to want to understand, do you have a budget? What kind of support do you have? And do you have a team to work with? So there are a lot of questions that will determine your ability to even be successful in this role. So I've gone through a lot of different specific ideas of the roles within DEI, but I just want to remind you again that there's some really specific soft skills, and I've listed several of them here for you to think of. And this is a combination of soft skills. So this isn't just a soft skill for one of the roles that I talked about, but it is important to understand how these soft skills can play together. And then there's also the hard skills. And again, when you're creating your resume, if you're thinking about applying to a DEI job, it's really important that you can communicate any hard skills that you are able to bring from your previous experience that's relevant to the experience and to what you're going to try to do in your new role within DEI. So it all seems fairly easy, right? And it's very simple on the surface if you think about just this kind of three-pronged strategy. But the reality is this work is really incredibly hard. Now, this next slide may scare a few of you, and it's messy and it's complicated. And I do that on purpose. I really like for people to think about this and to think about, how this works. But remember, even as easy as this may seem, there's actually a lot more that goes into it. The best laid plan can be derailed by sexism, current affairs, racism, homophobia, tokenism, ableism, a lack of budget, and that's just to name a few things. So, as you think about this more, I would love to connect with you and talk with you about whether or not a DEI role is a good fit for you and your skills and experience. You can connect with me here. I've got my website listed here. You can find me on Instagram and all of the different things. But for anyone who may be interested, this was just a small portion of my Introduction to DEI Careers course. And I'm actually going to offer all of you all a 50% off promotion using the code WT2. Just for today, you can use this code this week, and you can use this little thing. You can pull up your camera really quick before our session ends. And I do want to answer one question that came in while I was talking. And that question was, do I need a certification? The short answer is no. The long answer is it really depends on the company and it varies, unfortunately, but you can really find a lot of free trainings. And I talk a lot about that. And I even have a workbook that you can use to learn more if you take my course. So you can connect with me and I can answer a few more of your questions, but we are just out of time. And I want to thank you all so much for attending my session on demystifying DEI careers. Thanks.